It's been a while since I updated this. It's been long enough for me to grow a mustache, but it's been a fairly busy year, and I've just had other priorities that were at the top of my list. But I got an email earlier this week asking if I could take a stab at explaining what an anti-value is. Now, arguing an anti-value in Lincoln Douglas is obscure enough that I've never actually seen around where an anti-value was deployed, but I did a little digging around, a little reading, and a little asking around from my contacts who are involved in Lincoln Douglas debate, and I think I have a pretty good handle on it. Now, I will say it's an unusual enough approach that it hasn't really built up, it hasn't really become conventional, so it hasn't really become standardized. So even with what I described to you as far as the concept, it may be that if you go into a round where someone's arguing an anti-value, that what they do with it may surprise you. But this may help prepare you, kind of lay a foundation so you have some idea of what's going on, and then you can learn by doing, and that's, of course, what happens in all of debate. So the first thing we've got to do to establish this is we've got to make sure we clean up your thinking about what a value is, because there are some folks, and I'm not saying you necessarily, but there are some folks who think of a value in Lincoln Douglas as just kind of some language you have to get out of the way so that the judge won't gripe at you, and you have to start off the affirmative constructive by saying what your value is, and you might as well just say justice, because that's what everyone uses all the time. I've heard people say things like that. But when I teach beginning debaters how to have a value debate, what we usually do is we take a couple of very simple topics and we think our way through what the value would be, what the criteria would be, and they're more important than a lot of people think if they are leveraged successfully by the debaters. So one example of a simple topic we might use to illustrate the concept is resolve that dogs make better pets than cats. So a very strategic affirmative might say that, well, the reason that people get a pet in the first place is for companionship. So my value is companionship. Which pet makes the better companion? So then you get to criteria. Well, how do you measure companionship? You measure it by the frequency and variety of positive interactions. So how many different kinds and how often do you get positive interaction from a dog? Well, there's affection. A dog will show you affection a lot of different ways. A dog will lick you. A dog will hop up in your lap. A dog will follow you around. All of those are affectionate interaction. Then there's play. A dog will play with you, a dog will chase a ball and bring it back to you, a dog will wrestle with you, do tug-of-war with you, and it's pretty strategic to do it that way because, in all likelihood, even though cats will sometimes show affection, they'll rub up against you, and they'll sometimes play with you with, a thread or a laser pointer or something, they're quicker to sort of get sick of you and lose interest in you and wander off. So if you set it up that way, then that's a pretty favorable way of establishing what you're going to defend when you're on the affirmative. And, you would do it completely differently if you were going to be negative. Another example of this, I sometimes throw out, resolve that a Volvo is a better car than a Porsche. And so then we have to ask ourselves, well, of all the things that you're looking for when you shop for a car, what's the most important one? And I say if you're affirmative, what's strategic is to say that the value is safety. Because driving a car is a very dangerous thing, and if you don't get to your destination alive, then you forfeit enjoyment of all other values. So what criteria establish safety? Well, you might say, what are the safety design features? You might say, what is the history of survival of accidents of people who are driving that particular car? So in both cases, companionship, making dogs better than cats, and safety, making a Volvo better than a Porsche, you've got a measure that you're trying to maximize. You've got something positive and in some way measurable that allows you to play tiebreaker between the different sides set out by the topic. Okay, how does that prepare us to talk about an anti-value? Well, an anti-value is something that's bad that you want to avoid, and one of the simplest ways, well, let me back up about 2 steps. It's something that you cannot express as coherently as a positive. To get at the concept, you really have to express it as something that's negative that you try to pull away from. So, for example, what if we're talking about paramedics, and we're thinking about what it is that a paramedic's mission in life is? You might think, well, that's easy, that they have a value of life and preserving life. Well, the problem with that conceptually is paramedics routinely pay absolutely no attention to things that they could say to someone that they meet on a call, someone that they're taking care of, that could help them live longer or be more healthy. If you notice that someone's overweight, or if you notice that they have a lot of unhealthy food in their kitchen when you break into their home because they've broken their leg or cut themselves, you don't necessarily say, oh, look at all this cholesterol and all this food. Instead, a paramedic is going to be very finely focused on what is the immediate threat to the person's health, what is the immediate threat to the person's life, and what kind of first aid can I give. So how might this play out in a debate? Well, this is kind of a cumbersome topic, but let's imagine that the topic was resolved that funding paramedics is a more rational use of city resources than teaching everybody first aid. So that would be a value topic, with the ground for the affirmative being put your resources into your paramedics, and the ground for the negative being take those same resources and put them into teaching everybody how to do first aid. And really, it's kind of a quasi-policy topic. It's really resolved we should fund the paramedics more. But if you phrase it as a value topic and you're weighing between two different courses of action and just saying which one's more rational, which one's more appropriate, then really I think the affirmative could say my anti-value is death, or my anti-value is death, injury, suffering. And you could say that the team that does the most to alleviate death, injury, suffering, that sort of cluster of major traumatic health events, that's the team that ought to win. And you could say it's really not about maximizing life, because if that's the case, then where we should put our resources are into prevention. But that would completely evade what this debate is about, because this debate is not about maximizing health. It's not about making people as healthy as possible. It's talking about emergency first response, which is fundamentally a question of avoiding that which is negative. Now, sometimes what negatives will do is it's very similar to policy teams running a disadvantage. Negative teams will start out with there is an anti-value, and the affirmative side of the debate plays into the anti-value. So it could be that if you're debating resolve dogs make better pets than cats, you might say on the negative, my anti-value is wild behavior. My anti-value is wildness. That in all human interactions with animals, the thing we always have to keep in mind is that animals are wild. No matter how domesticated, no matter how long they've been around us, they are fundamentally unpredictable. They read our nonverbals, they get frightened by things that we don't even notice or pick up on. So it is rational to have a cat instead of a dog, because if a dog surprises you and goes wild and bites you or attacks you, a dog, most dogs anyway, unless they're like teacup or toy or something like that, most dogs are likely to do you a lot more damage than a cat. And of course that's debatable, and you could make arguments that for most breeds that cats are likely to be more ornery, that cats are quicker to attack. You could say all that, but as an opening negative strategy that illustrates the concept of an anti-value, the negative might say the anti-value is an outbreak of wild behavior from the animal. That's something that's to be avoided and is a good rational decision criterion, and that the affirmative plays into it. So that's kind of my swipe at explaining how an anti-value can fit into a debate, what the concept is, and how you might see it. Some of the people that I see that have been using anti-values, some of the descriptions of use of anti-value, capitalism is an anti-value. I really think it's kind of like a discussion we had on the homeschool debate forum at some point about a counterperm, where my first impression that I wanted to share with people was there are easier ways to make this argument. This is more trouble than it's worth. It is likely to result in confusion, and that is a big risk that you take. About the only time I would advise people to go after something like that kind of breaks out of the mold in that fashion, let me describe to you a judge that I remember having in one particular debate years and years ago, because this is a profile of a kind of judge you get every so often, and it could be in your local debating community. You can think of a judge who kind of fits this, and in that situation you might want to think about something like an anti-value. I was doing policy at the time, and we had this one disadvantage that we'd researched. It was the Canadian elections disadvantage. This thing was so convoluted. It was really, really hard to explain all the twists and internal links and so forth. And so we didn't run it very often, because when we did, judges at the end of the debate usually complained that they were really, really confused. And from the beginning, they weren't really sure what the argument was. But we got this one judge, and the thing about him was he was very curious by nature. He was the kind of person who really, really had a good time taking a complicated idea and just turning it over and over in his mind. That was his hobby. That was the kind of thing that made him happy. And we got coached before the debate, and our coaches told us, okay, this round, Canadian elections. And that was surprising, because we shied away from that. We had mostly only put it out there to, at times, waste the other team's time, get them to allocate their time unwisely, but very rarely had we staked the round on it. And we said, you're sure? And they said, yeah, not only run it, but go for it. And I remember saying, why? And they said, when the judge explains his decision at the end of the debate, you'll see what we mean. And he was just delighted by this argument, and he just kept talking on and explaining it to both teams, all the little nuances in it. And I don't want to sound hostile or condescending or anything, but it's almost like he had to show us how clever he was. It's almost like it was the best thing that had happened to him all day, that he had a truly tough argument to talk his way through, and that, because that was such a pleasant experience, he decided that we had done the better debating. He rewarded us for giving him that experience and voted for us. I say that to say that that is a profile of a judge you see every so often. That the debate world kind of selects for people who have that kind of curiosity, that kind of orientation to thinking through things that are complicated and working through them. It's almost a puzzle-solving mindset. And if you know your judging pool well enough that there is a judge, or maybe even more than one judge, who fits that persona, then it could be that that's a judge for whom the little bit of unexpectedness, the little bit of having to struggle with the idea and recalibrate your approach to thinking about debate, they could enjoy that enough that it could actually give you a little bit of an edge. And even if you don't wind up using an anti-value, there are other unconventional, slightly surprising arguments that are a little confusing and so forth, that for most judges, they'd be a bad idea. They'd be an unnecessary risk, and you're just better off going with something that's simple, straightforward, and easy to explain. But when you get one of those judges, one of those who gets all their pleasure in life out of thinking through the thicket, then that's the moment where an anti-value or an argument that fit in sort of that category might be a good choice.